I was held hostage in Congo for 8 days. That left an impression. I used to tell people I was going to retire before I was 35 because I wanted to see the world. Chinese was going to be the most important language in her lifetime. Inflation's not over. It's going to come back and it's going to be higher. The next time we have an economic problem, it's going to be terrible.
For this episode, I interviewed the legendary investor Jim Rogers. In case you don't know his story, in 1973, Jim and George Soros founded one of the most successful hedge funds in history, the Quantum Fund. By 1980, Quantum Fund returned more than 40 times the initial investments, which is mind-boggling. Unlike Soros, who continued running the fund, Jim retired from the industry and went on to travel the world, the adventures that he covered in his books. He now lives in Singapore and continues investing his own wealth. Before we start, I'd like to ask you for a quick favor. Please subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comment section, and let's continue growing this community together.
I've watched many of your interviews and they all start the same way, where they introduce you as a legendary investor. But when people ask you, when strangers ask you what you do, how do you answer?
I'm a simple person from the backwoods of Alabama. I try to make a living. I try to invest and have success. I make mistakes. I made many mistakes in my life. You want to hear about my first wife? What a horrible mistake that was. That was a terrible mistake. So I made many mistakes.
How about we talk a little bit about the global economy? What do you see? What's going on? Like for a person who doesn't know anything about the economy, only hears the noise. Can you tell me what's going on?
Well, the world economy, most of the world, has been pretty strong for 10 or 12 years. In fact, it's the longest in American history that this economy has been strong. And that's because many countries, especially the US, have printed a lot of money, borrowed a lot of money, and spent a lot of money. So for a while, the world economy has been fairly strong. These things have always come to an end. They will again. We have inflation coming back, which usually is the case. Which means we have interest rates going higher. So it's all going to come to an end sometime before too much longer. And then we will have a very bad economy for a while. I would remind you that in 2008, we had a bad economy because of too much debt. Well, since 2008, the debt everywhere has skyrocketed. The debt in America is higher than it's ever been, and in many other countries, Japan, many other places. The next time we have an economic problem, it's going to be terrible.
So what's the solution there? You can't just repay debt like overnight, right?
No, you're exactly right. That is one of the reasons that we keep having these problems, is because the debt keeps going higher and higher, and the politicians and the central banks say, let's just borrow some money. Let's just print some money. And they do. And so that means the debt is, America is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world now. So that's why we keep having problems in America. And the next time we have a problem, it's going to be very serious. Debt has always led to problems throughout history.
So if you were Jerome Powell, what would you do differently?
Yes. I would abolish the Federal Reserve and then I would resign.
Okay.
America's had 3 central banks in our history. The first 2 disappeared for a variety of reasons. This is going to disappear too eventually because they keep making mistakes.
In an ideal world, market's going to take care of themselves, but maybe we got used to Fed too much to just get rid of it.
We've had economies for a few thousand years, and America didn't always have central banks. As I said, the Federal Reserve is our 3rd central bank. The first 2 did disappear. Politicians come up with central banks as a way to save. When things go wrong, they need somebody to come along and give a lot of money to the economy and save the economy. That's why we have the main reason we have central banks now. And that's what's happened. In 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, the U.S. had more problems. There was a huge panic, huge collapse in 1907.
Mhm.
So the politicians said, well, let's get together and have a central bank, because the central bank can always supply more money to an economy when we have problems. And that's what they did. In 1913, they founded the Federal Reserve again for the third central bank. And so far, they say it's been good for the world.
If they announce that central bank, like Fed is disappearing tomorrow, what's going to happen with markets?
Oh, I have no idea what the Fed's going to do. I don't pay much attention to the Fed. I'm more interested in the world economy and what's happening in the world. Of course, I have to pay some attention to the Fed because they are a major, major player. And if they want to print a lot of money, we better pay attention. If they want to spend money, borrow money, spend it, we have to pay attention. But I do not get my investment advice from any central bank, including Washington, D.C. I don't know what they're going to do tomorrow. Probably going to.
Yeah, nobody knows. So do you
Well,
think they'll be able to contain inflation or?
Not yet. Nothing goes straight up or straight down. Markets go up a bit and then they come down, then they go back up. And that's what's going to happen with inflation. Things seem to be better now. They raised interest rates a few times. And so they are going to say, well, you see, the price of things is not going up so much anymore. Oil prices are down, commodities prices are down from their highs anyway. And so they're going to say everything is okay. It's not. Inflation's not over. It's going to come back and it's going to be higher. In the 1970s, we had this kind of problem and inflation went very, very high. I don't know if you remember, you don't look old enough, but in 1980, interest rates on Treasury bills, U.S. Treasury bills in 1980, interest rates were 21%. That's not a typo. Interest rates were 21% in the U.S. because inflation got so bad, interest rates had to go very, very high to calm the situation down. When inflation gets worse again, interest rates in the U.S. and in the world will go much higher.
Yeah, back then we had Volcker, right, who basically was able to stop inflation because of interest rate, right? And Carter lost his election because of that, probably because of that. Do you think there is will today among politicians to try something like that, even close to that?
Absolutely not. First of all, there's not much understanding, but even if they did understand, they're not going to raise interest rates high enough. They don't want to lose their jobs. In those days, actually, President Carter, as you point out, lost the next election, but he went to Volcker, who he made the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he said to him, you do whatever you have to do and I will support you. There is no politician in the world now who would say to a central bank, yeah, you do anything you need to end inflation and I will support you. Because it would take huge differences. I mean, huge increases in interest rates. The world is different from where it was in the 1970s. I mean, we had the Soviet Union in the 1970s. We had Red China. We had many things that we don't have anymore. The U.S. was still a creditor nation in the 1970s. Now the U.S. is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. So there are differences this time.
And it's not just U.S., right? Same thing is happening in Europe.
Well, the U.S. is the largest economy in the world, and therefore it usually has a major effect on what's happening in the world. Because it's so large, China is now the second largest economy, if you measure it in many ways. So and China, of course, was hardly around in 1980, but China is now here. It's a big player, a big factor. So the world is different now, but the basic rules of supply and demand don't change. And the basic rules about printing money don't change. If you print money, you're going to have inflation. You always have, and you always will.
When you look at China and the way they handle the situation, I don't think the inflation is high right now. I think official number is about 2% or something.
I have learned not to pay attention to official government numbers about things like inflation. The governments have many reasons not to tell the truth, and very few governments tell the truth about things like inflation. They have reasons not to. There is inflation everywhere. I mean, if the price of oil goes up, it doesn't go up just in the US, it doesn't go up just in Germany, it goes up everywhere. And that leads to inflation everywhere. The Chinese have inflation, everybody has inflation.
You've been pretty vocal about investing in commodities, right? You even wrote a book about it. And I guess in the time of inflation, commodities probably the good place to put your money, right? This is not investment advice, but overall. So when one thinks of investing in commodities, how do you value commodity? There is no cash flow, right?
Well, there's always the way you value anything is supply and demand. And if there's not much supply, prices are going to go higher, especially if demand goes higher. I mean, that's the basic rule. Now, it's certainly more complicated than that. But if you're looking around the world and you see more money being printed, that's probably going to lead to more demand, which will lead to more supply. And if at the same time you don't have more, that will lead to more demand. And if at the same time you don't have more supply, you're going to have higher prices.
So when
this is a basic, simple rule of economics.
But when you look at the prices, let's say silver, right? I think in a few recent interviews you mentioned that it looked cheaper relative to, I don't remember relative to what. Is it historical levels? Is it how you look at it?
Silver on a historic basis is certainly down over 50% from its all-time high. What you've seen me say is that compared to gold, gold is down only 10 or 15% from its all-time high. Silver is down over 50% from its all-time high. So on a historic basis, silver is cheaper than gold.
So you look at those two metals as it's almost like pair trade, right? They should, you think they should be moving about the same direction, or?
Well, historically, silver and gold do move more or less together. Not the same speed, not anything. But if silver goes up, gold is usually going up and vice versa.
Is there a possibility that both of them were quite a bit overvalued? Silver is 50% down from its high, right? Maybe it was overvalued back then and it's still overvalued now. Is that a possibility, or?
Well, it's certainly possible that everything, well, we're talking about silver and gold, but it's certainly possible that silver and gold are overvalued in the market right now. I suspect that we were talking, I know we were talking about inflation. If inflation is going to come back, or if inflation is going to continue, both of them will go higher eventually. But that does not mean that they won't go down for a while. I mean, we've had many markets. When gold goes down in a collapse in 2008, gold went down a lot at first, then it went up again a lot. But no, everything can go down when there's a bear market. Even if the fundamentals for whatever we're talking about, in this case, gold, even if the fundamentals were good for gold, it can still go down for a while. Just like anything else. Toyota can go down if there's a bear market going on. Microsoft can go down if there's a bear market in the world.
Speaking of Toyotas and Microsoft, do you invest in individual stocks at all?
I certainly do invest in individual stocks. I try to invest in anything where I can make money. If it's legitimate, yes.
But my view of your approach, and might be completely wrong, I always thought of you as a global macro person. You look more on the trend versus doing a bottom-up value investing type of analysis. Is it fair?
What you have said is accurate, but that does not mean I don't invest in individual stocks or bonds or currencies or anything, commodities. If I can find an opportunity, I hope I'm smart enough to buy that or sell it short, depending on what the opportunity is.
And when you look at the individual company, what's your approach? Do you like is it bottom up or it's like more also top down?
Well, usually, just to make sure we're talking about the same thing, usually I try to, based on the fundamentals and the facts of supply and demand for whatever it is, and it's usually the fundamentals, yes. There are times when I invest in ETFs because ETFs are simple, but the best, historically, I've invested in more individual stocks and commodities and currencies than anything else.
To clarify, what I meant to say is, let's say you looking at Ford Motors, right? You look at the balance sheet, you look at the financial statements, or you looking more at the demand on automobiles over the next 5 years, something like that, or you maybe a combination of both.
You have to look at everything, lots of things. I wish it were simple. When I was a professor, all the students wanted a simple answer. I would say, listen, you cannot turn to page 37 and find the answer. Investing is very complicated. Many factors go into making a good investment decision. So don't think that this is easy. You have to spend a lot of time examining a lot of things if you're going to be a successful investor.
So you moved to Singapore about 15 years ago?
Yes, yes.
Why did you do that?
For many years, I've been telling people you should teach your children and grandchildren Chinese. Well, then I had a child. I said, oh, gosh, what am I going to do now? So she was learning Chinese in New York, but I realized that if I was serious, I was going to have to take her or any child to a city where they have to speak the language. Many people would tell me in New York, when they get to be 8 or 10 years old, they will stop speaking the foreign language because it's not cool. They want to speak what their friends speak. They'll only want to speak English. And if you're trying to teach them German or Russian or Chinese, whatever it is, they won't speak it. So I realized that if I was serious, and I was very serious about it, I had to take us to a city where she didn't have any choice. And that's why we're in Singapore.
And why do you think it's empirical for kids to learn Chinese?
You can survive and succeed without speaking Chinese, but in my view, and still is, Chinese was going to be the most important language in her lifetime. I have 2 teenage daughters, and in their lifetimes, Chinese is going to be extremely important. I mean, there are other languages too, but in my view, Chinese was the most important.
Yeah, it's projected that China is going to be the largest economy fairly soon.
That's my view. Listen, I made many mistakes about many things, but we will see.
What do you think can prevent them from becoming the largest economy? What can go wrong?
Well, Beijing, the Chinese government can make mistakes. We can have a war. We have a huge war. If we have a war, history would indicate that even the people who lose the war will come out on the other side and have great success. I guess the main thing is mistakes by the government or a big war. I'm not looking for a big war, by the way.
Obviously.
Not my idea of fun, but you ask what could go wrong, that's one thing.
Back in 80s, Japan was considered to be this next big thing, right? And then maybe it was dead, or I don't know what exactly went wrong. Do you think something similar can happen to China, or not necessarily? It's a completely different story.
Well, I don't see that happening, but of course it can happen. Yes. China can make mistakes. The world can go crazy again and have a big war. No, certainly something can go wrong. The world always has problems. The world always has something going wrong. So of course something can go wrong in China, and it might. But at the moment, I don't see that.
And back to Singapore. Well, Singapore is known as a very well-run country. Like Lee Kuan Yew built very interesting country, let's just say that. Do you see any government programs and policies in Singapore, they could have been successfully applied in the US, for instance, in the federal or state levels?
Well, Singapore did a few things. It emphasized education. It also emphasized getting smart people to come here, and it emphasized low debt. The U.S. is the largest debtor nation in the world. So we have not emphasized low debt. The U.S. spends and borrows and spends some more. Singapore has not done that, not yet anyway. Who knows what will happen in the future? But no, Singapore has huge emphasis on education, huge emphasis on having smart people come here, huge emphasis on 2 languages, making sure everybody speaks at least 2 languages. Singapore has done a lot. It's been a great success, as you pointed out.
Do you think the size of the country and its geopolitics of Singapore also plays a role in that? Like, I never heard Singapore invest in its military.
That big of a military, but every Singapore boy has to go into the military, has to spend a fair amount of time in the military. They all have military training. Singapore has airplanes, boats, Navy has everything. They feel that they need a secure. Lee Kuan Yew, who you mentioned before, felt very strongly that he needed a strong military in case.
Interesting. Good to know. That's why it's nice speaking with you, Lauren, so much. Let's talk about Jim Rogers from the very beginning of Jim Rogers. Where were you born and grew up, Jim?
I was born in 1942. It was during the Second World War. My father, who was a military officer, happened to be stationed in Baltimore, which is an American city, large American city. When I came out, that's where he was. And my mother, who was a good military wife, was with her, followed her husband. And so when I came out in 1942, they were in Baltimore. And so we weren't there very long, but I was born in Baltimore.
And I think you mentioned you grew up in Alabama.
I grew up in Alabama. My father, after the war, he was from Alabama. He went back to Alabama. And so I grew up in Alabama.
What did your father do after the war?
Well, he and his brother in a small town in Alabama had a manufacturing plant. His brother had it before the war and during the war. My father was in the army and he went off to, fight in Europe. Then he went back and joined his brother in a manufacturing factory.
And your mom was a
housewife.
housewife.
In those days, people could do that. And my mother had 4 and eventually 5 children.
Oh, nice. You had many siblings.
5 boys in my family. I was the oldest of 5 boys.
Which one of you was a troublemaker? Because there's always one.
Well, my parents, for whatever reason, reared what we would consider good children. We liked school, we were good at school, we did well at school, and none of us were really serious troublemakers. I mean, none of us went to jail or got somebody pregnant or any of that kind of thing.
What's your favorite childhood memory?
Boy, that's a very good question. I guess just the very fact of growing up in a small town was a great memory. I went away to I went up to the north or the northeast to New England for university. And it was extremely different from what my childhood had been. And I guess that was good. The contrast of growing from a very small town in the backwoods of Alabama to a major cosmopolitan city in the Northeast. I guess that's the shock. That's the memory I remember the most.
I have a feeling that when you were growing up, you did not want to be an investor. You probably didn't even know what it is. Is it fair?
I had no idea what stocks and bonds were. It was all I knew about investing was that Wall Street was in New York and something bad happened in 1929. I hope I know more than that now, but that's all I knew back in those days.
So what did you want to be when you grew up? back then?
Well, originally I was going to be a doctor because that's what my parents thought I should be. And then when I realized I didn't want to go to medical school, I decided to become a lawyer because that's what everybody else in my university was doing. And then I realized, no, I don't want to. I stumbled onto Wall Street, had a summer job on Wall Street, and fell in love. It was a place where they would pay me and pay me well if I knew what was going on in the world. And that was what interested me a lot, the world. You know, whatever was happening in the world interested me a lot. And then I realized, hey, wait a minute. This is where I want to be, because here's a place that they will pay you to understand what's going on in the world, and they will pay you well if you do a good job.
So it sounds like you were a pretty curious person.
Yeah, looking back on, now you certainly, if you'd asked me when I was 20, I would not have said, oh, I'm mainly interested in what's going on in the world. Once I stumbled onto Wall Street, I realized, oh my gosh, what my main interest is what we would call current affairs or something like that, international affairs. And that was my main interest, and I realized that's where I should be. Many people never figure out what they really love, and they never really pursue it for many reasons.
How else would I describe you besides being curious at the age of 20?
Well, I try to teach my children to be curiosity. I want them to understand and question everything that they hear and see, because that's the only way. You know, whatever they see on the television or on the internet, they should question.
Well,
I want them to understand what's really going on in the world. And what you see on the internet or on the television is usually not the real story.
how do you find a real story, though?
You have to keep asking questions. You have to, you know, if you see on the internet that the sky is blue, go and look out the window. See if the sky is blue. I assure you, you have to keep questioning everything. And even then, you'll probably get it wrong, at least for a while. You know, if 100 people go into a room and we all hear the same thing, only 8 or 9 will get it right. I mean, judgment is the only thing that we all need, but I don't know how to teach judgment, except you keep asking questions until you finally figure out what's really happening.
And the nature of my question is almost, we're so biased. I can basically convince myself of anything.
The whole world is biased, and everybody, especially if the whole world hears a story, they accept it and they don't question it, and then they act. But that's not the way to make good judgments.
And you obviously learned this over the years, right? It's not that you knew back in the.
Well, I guess I really mainly learned it on Wall Street. I went to Wall Street and I figured, well, all these people are older than I am and educated, and they probably know what they're doing. Then I realized they didn't know either what they were doing. They all made mistakes too. And I realized you just have to keep asking questions if you're going to figure out what's really going on.
And when you're talking about you went to Wall Street, it was Dominic, right? Is it?
That was my first job, summer job, yes.
And what did you do there?
Well, that first summer, I was a research assistant. I was in the research department, and brokers would write in and say things. I don't know, does General Motors pay a dividend? What is the dividend? Pretty simple questions. And I would answer questions that came in from the field.
And then I believe you went out and you received your second degree, right? Why did you decide to do that? Like, you already had a job and it seemed like you liked it a lot.
I wanted to stay out of the draft. That was the days of the Vietnam War. But there was something called the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. I had delusions that I was going to go to Oxford and be in the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. It was my secret desire. I didn't tell anybody. I always talk about it now, but no, I wanted to be in the Oxford and Cambridge boat race.
And you didn't go, or you did?
I did go to Oxford, and I did make it into the Oxford and Cambridge boat race, yes.
But I believe you also ended up going to Vietnam War, right? You were drafted.
I had to go into the military. I did not go to Vietnam.
Got it. Yeah. And then you went back to Wall Street after that again, right?
Yes, as soon as I could, I went back to Wall Street.
And what did you do this time around? The same similar thing?
I was in the research department. I was a level above. I wasn't just answering simple questions. Then now I went back as a research analyst to how to analyze companies and to analyze investments, trying to look for good investments.
And one day,
and I loved it. I loved it.
you loved it, but one day you decided to start your own fund with your colleague.
Well, yeah, we started a hedge fund. But yes, but mainly I love the research, and that was the most exciting part of Wall Street for me.
Who did you raise money from? And because back then hedge funds it's not like today, there are like thousands of them, right?
There were very few in those days, very, very, very few. We could all meet in one room. There were not many of them. But if you are in the investment world, that is the single best way. The structure of a hedge fund is the single best way to make money, and that's why we go to Wall Street, to make money. And if you can invest successfully and take a percentage of the profits, which is what hedge funds do, that's the single most efficient way to make money.
Quantum Fund turned out to be one of the most successful funds in history. Like, what made it so successful? How much of it was timing, and how much of it was a unique perspective that you had?
Well, who knows? We both loved what we were doing. And I loved investing and I loved research. My partner was a better trader than I was. He loved what he was doing. I loved what I was doing. It was a perfect fit for both of us, and we succeeded.
And how were your duties different? Like, he was trading and you were doing research? Like,
I was mainly doing the research and he was mainly doing the trading.
In other words, you would make recommendation and he would find the timing when to invest? Is it the story?
Yes, in simple terms, yes. I would say let's buy X, and he would buy X and figure out the best way and time to buy X.
You're quite successful, and then you decide to retire.
Yes, all my life I had wanted to have more than one life. I used to tell people I was going to retire before I was 35 because I wanted to see the world. I wanted adventure. I look back on it, I'm sure my kids someday are going to say, I wish you hadn't quit so soon, but I wanted adventure. I wanted to see the world. It's a lifelong dream of mine to go around the world on a motorcycle, and I eventually quit so I could pursue that.
And tell me about that trip, because it became the basis for your book, right? Investment Biker.
Yes. Well, you have to remember, in those days, there was the Soviet Union, there was Red China. It wasn't so easy to just get on a motorcycle and go around the world. You had to get all kind of permission from all kinds of governments. But I eventually, at first the Russians said no, at first the Chinese said no, but eventually they all said yes and let me do it.
Why were you so curious in Russia and China, given Cold War and this history?
If you look at a globe, you'll see that Russia and China take up a lot of the world. If you're going to go around the world, you pretty much have to go through Russia and China. You don't have to, obviously, but in my view, you weren't really going around the world unless you saw everything. And that's why, it had nothing to do with anything except I wanted to see the whole world. To do that, Russia and China, Russia's the largest country in the world. China's the third or fourth largest country in the world. If you wanted to go and see the world, you had to go through Russia and China. It was it was impossible in those days. Eventually I got permission from both.
So you jumped on that BMW motorcycle and you went straight to...
I knocked on the Russians' door and the Chinese door a lot before I jumped on the BMW and went. If you just showed up and said, here I am to drive across your country, it probably would have put you in jail.
So over that trip, what would you say were the most memorable places or most unusual places that left the biggest impression on you?
I was held hostage in Congo for 8 days. That left an impression. Held hostage by the police, by the way. They wanted money. They wanted bribes. That was certainly a major impression. If you're in New York, where I was, and you go out the front door, it doesn't matter whether you go left or right or straight ahead, you more or less know what's going to happen. When you're driving around the world, you don't have any idea what's going to happen 5 minutes from now. And that was the exciting part. It was pure unknown and pure adventure.
Looking back, you actually enjoyed being hostage in that situation, Congo. What's
I
going
did
on?
not like being held hostage for 8 days. No, I didn't. I mean, it's all very pleasant. The police chief took us home to dinner with his family. He took us to the restaurant. We did all kind of things together. But he would not let us leave unless we paid him. Eventually, we convinced him we didn't have any more money, and so we left.
It's a pretty good ending there. Think nice. Glad you made it back. So, what was your route like? Can you kind of walk me through, like, where did you start and which countries you visited? I think there were like 52 countries, something like that.
Well, we started in Iceland, and we drove through Europe, Turkey, China, Japan, then back through Siberia and around Europe again, back to Ireland. And then we drove down through Africa, to the heart of Africa, to Australia, New Zealand, bottom of South America, up to Alaska, and then back to New York. That was 3 years. It was, long way, but I loved every minute of it.
Was it your first trip or second trip?
Second trip, see, I loved it so much that I wanted to do more. And so the second trip was 3 years. That first trip was 2 years. And the second trip was 3 years because I wanted to see more. And the second trip was in a car, one of a special Mercedes. I wanted to see more.
And I saw that Mercedes is a yellow. It looks very unique. Where did you get it?
Well, we had it made. Mercedes and I had it made. Picked yellow because there are very few yellow cars in the world. And I wanted something that would stand out for safety reasons. If you come driving up to a border in a bright yellow car, they notice you. But they also probably aren't going to try to steal your car or whatever because they know that there's not another car like this. So I hoped it would help us safety-wise. It did.
So during those trips, they've been, what, 20, 30 years ago? No, 30, 40 years, right? Did you see anything like culturally or economically that you would have predicted that, okay, this country is going to fail or actually rise because of something unique that's not known at the moment yet?
Well, Botswana, when I crossed the border in Botswana, I could realize this was different from other African countries. So I went down and started making investments across Russia, and I knew that Russia could not succeed. In my view, it could not succeed. So I knew that would fail. No, there were certainly various countries where we could see good things happening. And there were other countries we could see bad things happening.
Tell me about Botswana. What was different about them?
Well, I'd driven through the middle of Africa and very few roads, very few anything, lots of people looking for bribes. When we crossed the border into Botswana, everything went very smoothly, just took a few minutes. Nobody asked for a bribe. There were real highways with signs that said what was happening and where you were going. And so I could see whatever this is different from everything else. And by the time I got to the capital, I knew it was a different country. And so I found the stock exchange and went down and started making investments.
Well, that sounds pretty simple, but I'm sure it wasn't.
It does sound simple, but don't think it's easy. It's not. But it was certainly after seeing several countries in Asia and in Africa and seeing that most of them did not work and were not honest, suddenly I found a country where everything worked and where they were honest and efficient.
Is it still the case? Is Botswana still one of those?
It still is. It's not nearly as bad as many countries. It's still a very efficient place.
When you look at the frontier, not frontier, but developing countries today, which one is undervalued? Let's just use that word.
Well, certainly China. China is
Still,
becoming an extremely successful country. Uzbekistan, which is one of the former Soviet countries, is when under the Soviet Union, it was a disaster, but now they have people running it who would run the country the way you and I would run the country. Those are a couple of, I mean, that's a place that I have started making investments because there are lots of assets there and people who know what to do, and that doesn't mean they will succeed. But Uzbekistan is certainly a country that's on my list where I've been making investments. If you look around, there's always somebody doing well and always somebody doing badly.
I wouldn't expect to hear Uzbekistan. That's interesting.
You should go. If you haven't been to Uzbekistan, you should go. Magnificent sights to see, everything. It's a very, very promising place.
I should. I know quite a few Uzbeks here in San Francisco. So yeah, I guess I should go.
Yeah, and many of the Uzbeks for a long time got out of Uzbekistan under the communists, under the Soviets. Nobody wanted to be run by the Soviets, but now that's all changing. But many Uzbeks left for many decades. Uzbeks left. Maybe they should go back.
You've written several books. Hot Commodities, How Anyone Can Invest Profitably in the World's Best Market. Do you still think anyone can do it, or it's not necessarily for everyone?
Well, anybody can invest, but not everybody can invest successfully. It's not easy. It looks easy. Everybody says, oh, I could have bought Apple. You know, if it was so easy, we'd all be rich. It's not easy. That book about commodities was mainly because I used to be on TV talking about commodities, and a publisher called me and said, you know, commodities are a big market, but nobody knows anything about them. So I wrote that book mainly to explain how commodities work, because there was very little knowledge about commodities. I mean, everybody knows what cotton is, but nobody really knew much about commodity markets. I mean, some do, obviously. So they suggested that I write a book about commodities, and the book was really mainly to explain. It wasn't a book of hot tips. It was explaining how what these markets were and how you invested in them.
Since then, my guess is the understanding of how to invest in commodities became more of the mainstream. But do you think like regular Joes and Janes should invest in commodities, or what's your take in general?
Not unless they know what they're doing. They shouldn't invest in anything. If you want to be successful, you should invest only in what you yourself know a lot about. If you know a lot about copper and cotton and wheat and things like that, sure. But if you don't know anything about them, please do not invest until you know a lot about it.
And the best way to know about it, it's basically focus and learn.
Well, you can lose money a few times. That's a good way to learn. Not the best way, but just read and watch and study and see what's going on.
Looking back at your investment career, do you think investing became harder? Let me just rephrase it. Is it harder to outperform the market?
Throughout history, very few people have done better than the averages. Very few people have done even as well as the averages throughout history. Mm-hmm. It's a shame because the studies show that most people cannot even do as well as the averages. It's a shame. It's a bad statement about the investment world, but I wish it were easy. It's never been easy for me. The facts are that very few people do well in the investment world.
Why do you think it's the case?
It's hard work. Everybody gets carried away with their own emotions or with what other people tell them, instead of just staying with what they know a lot about. They get swept away with, the latest hot tip, the latest thing they see on the internet, what their friends say. I mean, I wish it were easy. It'd be wonderful if it were easy.
How much of investing is driven by your ability to control your emotions versus your truly having fundamental understanding of what you're doing?
should be able to do both. I mean, I don't know the answer to your question, but I do know that you have to have your emotions under control and you have to know your facts.
Do you have like a rule of thumb when to cut losses?
I know people who have, stop loss orders, they automatically sell if a stock goes down 15%, whatever percent they use. I do not do that. I often wish I had. It's certainly been a good way that would have protected me many times. Mainly what I do is when I see things are going wrong, I do a lot more work to find out if I'm right or wrong. And then I take other action if I figure out whether I'm right or wrong. But as I say, many times I wish I had stop losses, like a lot of people do.
You wrote another interesting book named A Gift to My Children. How's it different from any other book you wrote?
Well, when I started having children, I realized there were a lot of things I wanted to make sure they knew, a lot of things I wanted to teach them, but they were too young to understand. So it's actually started by a series of articles in a Japanese magazine. There were several articles, and then the Japanese said, why don't we make this into a book? So it started out as a series of articles of things that I would teach young people about the world. And then we realized, hey, we've got a book here. And so we published it as a book. And then we published it in English as well.
So it's primarily the advice to parents?
It's things that I wanted to make sure I taught my children when they got older. A lot of things you can tell an 8-year-old they don't understand. It doesn't sink in. But maybe when they're 28, it will sink in.
How does your approach of raising kids different from the way your parents raised you?
Well, it's a very good question. I don't have an answer. I do know you have to be disciplined. You have to do your homework, whatever it is that needs to be done. My parents were certainly very adamant about that, and I have tried to teach my children, you do your homework, be on time, have good manners, all of the things that my parents taught us, I've tried to make sure my children know too.
I've watched quite a few videos of you and your family. You have this celebrity status almost in Asia. Given your celebrity status, how do you prevent spoiling your kids, and how do you make sure that they not get too much attention and that might affect them somehow?
You're asking great questions. I hope you can ask me in 20 years if I did it right or not. I've taught my children all their lives that we weren't rich. My children, would go to school saying we're not rich, and then everybody would laugh at them and said, what are you talking about? Everybody knows your family. You are rich. So I don't know how you deal with it. You have to think. Being a parent is not easy. It's fun. It's huge, huge fun. But it's not easy. Not as easy as it looks.
If I asked your daughters what they've learned from you, what would they say?
Who knows? Who knows? They probably don't know themselves yet. If you had asked me when I was a teenager, I would have probably said nothing. I learned it all myself. I was a cocky teenager. They probably do not know yet. I certainly did not know when I was 14 what I had learned from my parents. I look back on it, I have a better idea. But when I was a teenager, what do teenagers know? All teenagers think they're the smartest people around. They're not. Teenagers are not the smartest people around.
If I ask your daughters in 30 years what they've learned from you, what do you wish they say? Well,
I hope they say, well, the one word which is most important is persevere. We all know smart people are not successful. We know beautiful people are not successful. We know educated people are not successful. The people who are successful in the world are the idiots who never give up. They never, ever stop. They keep trying, keep trying, keep trying. So persevere. I guess if I had to use one word, it would be persevere. Discipline, of course, curiosity. So I have a quick blitz for you, Jim. I'll ask you a quick question and you give me a quick answer. Sounds good? What's your favorite movie? Oh, I don't have one. I don't know. I don't go to the movie very often.
What's your favorite music artist?
Well, I would probably say Mozart, but I don't like saying that because I frequently come across some great musical artists. But if I had a single word, it would be Mozart.
Do you watch sports at all?
A little bit, not much. I mean, my first time in the Guinness Book of Records was rowing. When I was in college, I was on the crew, the rowing team. So yes, that was what I was interested in when I was in college. And I still read the rowing results.
Oh, your favorite country to visit?
Well, that's an extremely good question. I've been to many countries. I'm going to say China, but there are many. I mean, I've been to North Korea a couple of times. I'd like to go back. I've started investing in Uzbekistan. I want to go back to Uzbekistan. You know, the problem with your question is there's so many wonderful countries to visit. Even the bad countries are great places to visit.
What's the first item on your bucket list?
The country that I haven't been to that I want to, I want to go to Chad. If you ask me why, I don't know, except I haven't been there. You know, Chad is high on my list, but I've been to so many countries, you know, there are not many countries left that I want to visit. But any country I haven't visited is certainly on my list.
You've mentioned that you visited North Korea.
Yes.
And did you say
twice.
you invested in North Korea too?
No, it's not legal
Yes.
it's not legal for Americans to invest in North Korea, so I have not invested in North Korea.
If there is ever opportunity to invest in North Korea, is it like a good country to invest in?
Well, it's very cheap with lots of resources, so it possibly, but there's no stock market. So if you're going to invest in North Korea, you would have to go there and start a business or invest in a business.
So in a sense, North Korea is like Soviet Union of 80s or China of what, 70s, 60s? Is it what it is?
That's a good analogy. Yes, yes, yes.
Got it. So last question for you, Jim. What life advice would you give your 15-year-old self?
If I'd been smart in the 70s or 80s, I would have gone to Asia. Now, I didn't, and I had a wonderful life in New York. I loved it. I had a great time, great fun. Went around the world a couple of times. But I guess if I'd really been smart, I would have gone. I could see what was happening in China. I first went to China in 1984. I could see that this country was going to be a gigantic success. But I didn't move there. I went back to New York and to other parts of the world and had a lot of fun.
Well, Jim, you had the most fascinating life I probably witnessed. Like you've been successful in business, you travel the world, you have fantastic family. Everyone can. I don't even know why I asked that. You had the perfect life.
I've made plenty of mistakes. I hope I live long enough to make many more mistakes.
I wish you to
learn
live
from
long
them.
enough, but not make any mistakes.
Oh, that would be wonderful. That'd be a good life, good life.